In the autumn of 2024, a small group of officials inside Buckingham Palace began a process that, on the surface, looked entirely unremarkable. A routine review. The kind of administrative housekeeping that happens inside large institutions all the time. Files were pulled. Records were cross-checked. Lawyers were consulted. Nobody outside that room knew it was happening. There was no announcement. No leak. No briefing to royal correspondents. For months, this process moved forward in complete silence. And by the time it finished, two children, Archie Harrison and Lilibet Diana Mountbatten-Windsor, had been quietly and permanently written out of the official future of the British monarchy. This is the story of how that happened. Not through scandal, not through punishment, through paperwork. And to understand it, we have to start somewhere most people would never think to look. A filing cabinet. From 1917. If you ask most people what governs who counts as a prince or princess in Britain, they will not know the answer. Most assume it is simply a matter of birth. You are born into the family, therefore you are royal. Simple. It is not simple, and it has not been simple for over 100 years. In 1917, the world was unrecognizable from what it had been just 3 years earlier. The First World War had already claimed millions of lives. Empires that had existed for centuries were buckling. In Russia, the Romanov dynasty, cousins of the British royal family, was in the process of being violently overthrown. Within a year, the Tsar and his entire family would be executed. King George V was watching this happen to people he was related to by blood, and he understood something with sudden clarity. Royal status could not simply be assumed. It needed to be defined, legally, precisely, in writing. So he issued a document called the Letters Patent of 1917. It was not poetic. It was not symbolic. It was law. And inside it were 3 conditions. Every royal child, going forward, had to meet all 3. The first condition was bloodline. The child had to come from a verified, recognized royal line. No ambiguity allowed. The second condition was official recognition of the birth by the crown itself, not by the parents, not through an announcement the family chooses to make. The royal household had to formally record and claim the child as its own. The third condition was baptism into the Church of England. Registered, documented, recognized by the Church's own official records. For over 100 years, every single royal birth met all 3 conditions without exception. Nobody questioned it. Nobody needed to. The system simply worked. Until 2019. That year, Archie Harrison Mountbatten-Windsor was born. And for the first time in a century, something in the paperwork did not look the way it was supposed to. Here is what investigators looking back at this period found. Archie's birth certificate was initially filled out the way every legal document of its kind is filled out. His mother's name appeared as Rachel Meghan Markle. Full legal name. Standard practice. Then, at some point after the initial filing, the document was changed. Her legal name was removed. In its place appeared a title. Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of Sussex. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what a birth certificate actually is under British law. It is not a document that gets updated as someone's circumstances change. It is a permanent legal record. Once filed, it is meant to stay exactly as it was filed, forever. When this change was discovered, it generated quiet but serious concern inside the institution responsible for maintaining these records. Meghan later said publicly that she had not wanted the change, that the palace had pressured her into it. Palace sources said the opposite, that Meghan herself had requested it. Neither side ever provided documentation that settled the question definitively. But here is what mattered to the people inside the palace whose job it is to maintain the integrity of royal records. It did not matter, in the end, who was telling the truth. What mattered was that a royal birth certificate now had a documented alteration attached to it. A change nobody could fully explain. A gap in the official story. And once a gap like that exists in a legal record, it does not close on its own. It sits there, waiting. 2 years later, in 2021, a second child arrived. Lilibet Diana. And this time, the gap was not subtle. For every previous royal birth in living memory, the pattern had been the same. The birth happens. The royal household is notified. An official announcement goes out from Buckingham Palace, carrying the institutional weight of the crown itself. Royal physicians are involved. The event is documented, witnessed, and entered into the official record, the same record that traces back through generations. None of that happened with Lilibet. The announcement came from California. From Harry and Meghan's own communications team. A warm, carefully written press release, with no palace seal, no royal household confirmation, and crucially, no formal crown record of the birth being created at all. To most people watching from outside, this looked like exactly what it appeared to be on the surface. A couple who had stepped back from royal life, announcing their own child's birth in their own way. Nothing strange about that. But to the people inside the palace responsible for maintaining the unbroken chain of official royal records stretching back over a century, something significant had just happened. For the first time in modern history, a child born into the Windsor family had entered the world without the crown formally claiming her as part of that record. The second of the three conditions from 1917, official recognition by the crown itself, had not been met. The palace said nothing publicly. And that silence was not an absence of reaction. It was the reaction. Sources familiar with how the institution operates described this period as one where the palace was not ignoring what was happening. It was documenting it, quietly building a record of its own, a record of gaps, while the rest of the world focused on headlines. Then came the third condition. And this is where things moved from administrative concern into something with real legal weight. Several months after Lilibet's birth, Meghan spoke publicly about a baptism that had taken place in California. She described it warmly. A family celebration. A meaningful spiritual moment. And for almost anyone else in the world, that is exactly what it would be. A private family event, beautiful and complete in itself. But under the 1917 letters patent, a royal baptism is not simply a spiritual event. It is the formal mechanism that legally connects a royal child to the Church of England, an institution the British Crown has been constitutionally bound to since the 16th century. For that connection to exist in the eyes of the law, the baptism has to be registered with the Church of England itself. According to people familiar with church records, Lilibet's baptism in California was never registered with the Church of England. This is the detail that changes everything about this story. Because up to this point, what we have is a series of administrative gaps. An altered birth certificate, a birth announcement that bypassed official channels. Individually, either one could perhaps be explained away, dismissed as a misunderstanding, or corrected with the right paperwork at the right time. But now there were three conditions established in 1917, and on paper, in the official record that the institution actually relies on, none of the three had been fully and properly met. For an institution that operates almost entirely through precedent, documentation, and unbroken procedure, this was no longer a collection of minor irregularities. It was a pattern. And patterns, inside an institution like this, eventually require a decision. While all of this was unfolding in paperwork that almost nobody outside the palace ever saw, something else was happening. Something much more human. According to people with knowledge of private conversations during this period, Prince Harry began reaching out. Not through lawyers, not through public statements, through phone calls, late at night, personal, emotional. He asked the palace to reconsider. He pushed for Archie and Lilibet to be formally written into the royal record, regardless of what the paperwork currently showed. He argued that whatever had happened between him and his family, his children were still grandchildren of the king, still carried Windsor blood, that this should count for something, regardless of documentation. According to accounts of these conversations, the response from the palace was calm, consistent, and completely unmoved. One official is said to have responded with a single sentence. This is not about emotion. This is about order, lineage, and the future of the crown. For Harry, that sentence reportedly landed differently than anything else he had heard from the institution since stepping back, because it was not an argument he could push back against. It was not a position open to negotiation. It was a description of how the system works. A system that does not make exceptions based on how anyone feels about it, including a prince, including the king's own grandchildren. And so, eventually, the quiet review that had been running in the background for months reached its conclusion. The documents were finalized. There was no press conference, no statement, no announcement of any kind beyond the formal filing itself. The consequences, according to people familiar with the outcome, were comprehensive. No royal titles for either child. No ceremonial roles. No place in the official line of succession. No entry in the permanent royal archives, the records that institutions, historians, and future generations rely on to document who has and has not been part of the royal family's official story. In the world of this institution, a title is not simply a name. It is a formal link to a continuous historical record that stretches back centuries. Without that link, a child exists outside that record entirely. Not erased from existence, obviously, but absent from the specific, narrow, formal category of documented royal history. And the way this decision was made tells you something important about how this institution actually operates, as opposed to how people often assume it operates. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public statement responding to years of interviews, documentaries, and public commentary from Harry and Meghan. The palace never engaged with any of that directly. Instead, while the public conversation happened entirely in one direction, the institution was quietly doing something else, reviewing records, identifying gaps, following a procedure that had existed, unchanged, since 1917. The outcome was not the result of anger or punishment or a response to any specific interview or statement. It was the result of three conditions established over 100 years ago, simply not being met. And an institution that has survived for centuries by following its own rules, applying them exactly as written. What does this actually mean going forward? Archie and Lilibet will continue to grow up in California, raised by parents who are, by every visible indication, deeply present and involved in their lives. They will not carry the formal weight of royal titles. They will not appear in the official archives that document the Windsor line. They will not, under the current state of these records, be part of the formal historical record of the British monarchy. What they will have is something many royal children, historically, have not had. A childhood largely outside the institutional structure that comes with significant pressures of its own. For the institution itself, this entire episode demonstrates something about how it actually functions. Not through public confrontation, not through statements responding to media coverage, through quiet, internal processes that move at their own pace, governed by documents written generations ago, and that eventually produce outcomes regardless of what is happening in the public conversation at the same time. The documents from 1917 were written to protect a monarchy from the kind of chaos that was, at that moment, destroying other royal families across Europe. They were written to remove ambiguity, to make royal status something defined, not assumed. 107 years later, those same documents were quietly applied again, not as a punishment, not as a statement, as a procedure, completed exactly as written, in an institution that has always understood that its real authority lies not in what it says, but in what it documents. That is the story, quiet, procedural, and, in its own way, exactly as the institution intended things to work from the very beginning. That's all for today here at Royal Report Daily. If you want to stay ahead of every development inside the palace as it happens, subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications. We bring you the documented stories, the real ones. The royal world never stops moving, and neither do we.